It wasn't lipstick that gave him away. It was a receipt for linguine and lies. I found it while doing laundry, of all things. His navy blazer pocket, the one he only wore to client dinners and architectural showcases, had a crumpled paper from a restaurant I'd never been to. 2 entrées, 1 dessert, a bottle of wine that cost more than my monthly car payment. The signature at the bottom was his neat scrawl. The date, last Thursday, the same night he said he was meeting the new clients from Chicago. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. At first, I told myself it was nothing. I even smoothed the receipt and set it on the counter, as if the creases could be ironed out of the lie. He came home an hour later, smelling of cedar and cologne, humming a tune that didn't belong to our house. He smiled, kissed my cheek, and asked if the mail had come. His phone buzzed. He flipped it face down. A reflex, casual, practiced. Busy night? I asked, holding the receipt between 2 fingers. He glanced at it, smiled wider, too wide. Business dinner, he said, the words polished like stones. Client wanted Italian. You know how it goes. I wanted to laugh at that. I wanted to ask why his client needed a second dessert and why the waiter had written happy anniversary in gold marker on the back of the bill. But I didn't. I just said, sure, and tucked it into the drawer with the warranties and expired coupons. The next day, during my break at the clinic, I saw the photo. Someone had tagged him on social media, one of those restaurant check-ins that people post for attention. The picture was cropped, meant to look casual, but I knew his hand anywhere. Long fingers, wedding band glinting, his thumb tracing over a woman's knuckles. The caption read, "Perfect night with perfect company." My stomach clenched like it wanted to throw itself away. That night, I folded his shirts in silence. My hands worked automatically, smooth, tuck, fold, stack, a nurse's precision, detached and steady. Inside, my thoughts moved faster than my pulse. I wasn't sad, exactly. I was rearranging, cataloguing facts. Thursday night, restaurant, hand, smile, lie. When he came home, I was sitting on the porch, a box beside me. "What's this?" he asked, pointing to it like it might be contagious. "Your clothes," I said. "I thought they deserved fresh air." He laughed, then saw my face and stopped. "You're overreacting, Dana." "That's what you said when the roof leaked," I replied, and then the ceiling fell. He started to protest, but I stood up and went inside, locking the door behind me. Through the glass, I saw him pick up the box, drop it, and kick it once. Then he left. The porch light stayed on. So did I. I didn't cry. That's what everyone expects, right? The trembling wife, the mascara tears. I just cleaned, wiped the counter, organized the medicine cabinet, scrubbed the sink until it shone. Cleaning helps me think. It's a nurse thing. When the world turns crooked, I find straight lines to hold on to. By the next morning, I had a plan. Not revenge yet. Just data gathering. Observation. You don't treat an infection before identifying the source. Paul left for work early, muttering about a site inspection. I packed my lunch, drove to the clinic, and spent the day pretending to care about blood pressure readings and insurance forms. I could feel my co-worker's eyes on me. Dana, the composed one, the nurse who never loses her cool. If only they knew the buzzing in my head. Around noon, I got a text from Grace Henderson, our HOA president and self-appointed guardian of morality. Heard Paul's been working late. Everything okay? Grace's curiosity could outpace the internet. I typed back, "Fine, just busy season," then deleted it. She'd find out soon enough. People like Grace always do. At 3, I was charting a patient when I overheard 2 younger nurses gossiping by the coffee machine. Something about an architect, a new client, an affair that was like a TV show. I didn't look up. I didn't need to. This town runs on whispers, not water. After work, I stopped by the grocery store, grabbed wine and cat food, my two main support systems, and drove home. The sky was pink, the kind of color that makes you believe in second chances. I parked, got out, and froze. Paul's car wasn't there, but a strange one was. Sleek, red, expensive. Parked half on the curb, like it belonged more to attention than convenience. I went inside, and the smell hit first. Floral perfume, sharp and artificial. Not mine. A wine glass in the sink, lipstick stain on the rim. I felt my throat tighten, then forced a breath. Calm, steady, assess the scene. In our living room, the throw blanket was rumpled, cushions dented. His phone charger moved from the nightstand to the couch. I stood there, counting each small betrayal like heartbeats. Then I opened a window, let the scent drift away. That night, I didn't confront him. He came home late, humming again, kissed my forehead, and went to bed. I lay awake, listening to him breathe. The rhythm annoyed me, too peaceful, too undeserved. Morning came, bright and smug. He left for work without a word. I followed an hour later but didn't drive to the clinic. I parked across from his firm, coffee in hand, pretending to read emails. At 10:30, he walked out, tailored suit, charming grin, and met her, the woman from the photo. She wore a cream coat and confidence like armor. He held the door for her, his hand brushing her back. She laughed, loud and genuine. I watched them disappear into a cafe. My pulse steadied again. Seeing it was worse than suspecting, but at least now I knew the terrain. I stayed until noon, then went to work, smiling through my shift as if nothing had changed. Patients complimented my calm demeanor. My boss said I had a healing presence. If only they knew what kind of surgery I was planning. That weekend, Paul announced he had to visit a client property out of town. I nodded, asked if he wanted me to pack snacks. He hesitated, suspicious of my civility, then said no. After he left, I opened the laptop he always left on the kitchen counter. No password change yet. Bold of him. Emails, expense reports, calendar entries, all there. He'd billed 2 weekend getaways as site visits, same hotel both times, same initials for client. Melanie C. I scrolled through photos of model layouts, architectural drafts, and then one folder labeled Inspiration. Inside, images of restaurants, beaches, hotel terraces, and one of her, sitting across from him, candlelight reflecting in her glass. His reflection captured beside hers, unaware. I copied the files to a flash drive and closed the laptop. Then I cleaned again. By the time he came back Sunday night, I was folding laundry and humming. "How was the trip?" I asked. He hesitated, then smiled. "Productive." "Good," I said. "Dinner's in the oven." He looked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. I almost laughed. The trick to revenge isn't anger, it's patience. Monday morning, I called in a favor. One of our patients, Mr. Dalton, ran a printing company. I asked if he could make copies of some project documents. Within an hour, I had crisp duplicates of every incriminating file. I labeled them neatly: more projects, personal use. At lunch, I sat in my car, staring at the stack. My reflection in the windshield looked calm, almost detached. If someone had told me a week ago that I'd be plotting against my husband, I would have said they'd watched too many shows. But here I was, halfway between heartbreak and strategy. That evening, Grace appeared at my door, holding a casserole like a peace offering. "Just thought you might like some company," she said, voice syrupy. "Thanks," I said, taking it. "Is this sympathy or curiosity?" She grinned. "A little of both." She settled on my couch, launching into neighborhood updates. The Hendersons' divorce, the Millers' new fence, the HOA's landscaping drama. I nodded, half listening, until she lowered her voice. "You know, I saw Paul the other day," she said. "Downtown, with a woman. I almost said hi, but he looked busy. Did he? I asked, stirring the casserole absently. Grace leaned closer. I'm sure it's nothing, but you know how these things start. Oh, I do, I said, smiling. They start with dinner receipts. She blinked, unsure if I was joking. Then she laughed nervously and left soon after. As her car disappeared down the street, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not sorrow. Focus. Tuesday, I met Tom Baker at work, our quiet technician. He noticed I was distracted. You okay? He asked, scanning lab reports. Fine, I said. Just tired of fixing other people's messes. He chuckled. That's the job description, isn't it? Maybe, I said, but some messes need a bigger mop. That night, Paul came home later than usual, looking rattled. Someone from the firm asked about my expenses, he muttered. Apparently there's confusion with the company card. Confusion, I repeated, setting down my mug. Imagine that. He narrowed his eyes. You wouldn't happen to know anything. Paul, I interrupted, if I wanted to make your life harder, you'd already know. He stared at me, uncertain, then went upstairs. I smiled into my tea. He was starting to feel it, the ground shifting beneath him. Wednesday morning, I watched him leave, then drove to the firm. The receptionist recognized me, spouse perks. Just dropping off something for Paul, I said, handing over an envelope addressed to partners, confidential. Inside were copies of the expense reports. I didn't wait for the explosion. I went home, poured coffee, and sat by the window. The street looked peaceful, children biking, sprinklers ticking, the illusion of normal. My phone buzzed an hour later. A message from Paul. We need to talk. When he came through the door, his tie was loose, his face pale. They suspended me, he said. Someone sent those receipts to the partners. They think I've been misusing funds. How awful, I said, genuinely managing sympathy in tone, if not feeling. They won't listen to me. They said the documentation was too detailed. Well, architects should appreciate details, I said. He paced, muttering about betrayal, about enemies. He never once said sorry. Not once. That told me everything. After he left again, probably to beg his partners for mercy, I sat on the couch and finally allowed myself a small, humorless laugh. The sound startled me. It wasn't joy, it was recognition. I'd spent years stitching together a life that looked perfect from the outside. Now I was the one pulling the threads. That evening, I poured wine and scrolled through social media again. Melanie's profile was private, but her friends weren't. There she was, tagged in another photo. Different restaurant, same smug smile. Caption: Some people have no idea what's coming. I tilted my head, smiled back at the screen. Neither do you, I said quietly. Later, while washing the dishes, I caught my reflection in the window. My hair slightly messy, face calm, eyes sharp. Not the betrayed wife everyone expected. More like a scientist watching an experiment succeed. I thought about the life we'd built, the house, the friends, the Sunday barbecues. Every brick, every smile. Now part of the facade I planned to dismantle. By midnight, I'd packed his remaining clothes into boxes again. This time, I left a note on top. Design flaw, lack of integrity. When I opened the front door to set them out, the porch light flickered, catching my face in the glass. I didn't recognize the woman staring back. She looked steadier, sharper, maybe even free. Somewhere down the street, Grace's curtains shifted. Of course, she was watching. This neighborhood thrived on other people's stories. Let them have mine. It would keep them busy for months. I closed the door, leaned against it, and exhaled. The house was quiet, except for the ticking of the clock. Each second felt deliberate, like it was waiting for something. Tomorrow, I'd start finishing my degree, move closer to the hospital in the city. But tonight, I stood in the stillness of my own making, surrounded by the scent of lemon cleaner and resolve. Maybe this was what freedom smelled like, citrus and silence. Outside, a car engine started, then faded down the street. Paul leaving again, probably to salvage whatever pieces of his image he could. He'd learn soon enough that some things can't be rebuilt. I turned off the porch light. Not to hide, just to rest. There would be plenty of illumination when the next part began. And as I climbed the stairs, I smiled to myself, small and sure. The demolition had only just begun. I woke up the next morning to the sound of sprinklers and gossip. Grace Henderson was standing on her lawn in a robe, waving her phone like a traffic signal, probably alerting the entire block that the Moores were having marital adjustments. From the look she gave me when I opened my curtains, I suspected she'd already drawn up a presentation about it. I waved back, cheerful as sunshine, and went to make coffee. The kitchen smelled of last night's lemon cleaner and a little bit of victory. Paul had stayed at his mother's house, judging by the silence that filled the rooms. The absence felt lighter than I expected, like taking off a coat that had been too heavy for too long. By the time I got to the clinic, my phone had lit up with messages. A few sympathetic emojis from coworkers, one from my boss asking if I was doing okay, and a cryptic "Stay strong, girl" from someone who'd clearly been talking about me behind my back. The suburban information highway ran faster than the hospital Wi-Fi. At the nurse's station, Tom looked up from his computer. "You all right?" he asked, cautious. "I'm fine," I said, smiling. "Just adjusting to quieter mornings." He nodded. "Heard you've been in the spotlight lately." "I always wanted fame," I said. "Just didn't think it would come through HOA channels." I went through the motions, taking vitals, checking meds, smiling at patients. But under the surface, my thoughts were running like a motor. Paul might have been suspended, but suspension wasn't the same as ruin. Men like him always managed to rebuild. Slick charm, another firm, another opportunity. I needed to make sure the foundation stayed cracked. At lunch, I sat outside the clinic, eating salad from a paper container and scrolling through social media again. Melanie had gone quiet. No more posts, no tags, but a new account had popped up under a pseudonym, filled with photos of expensive dinners and cryptic captions like, "Worth the wait." I couldn't prove it was her, but it didn't take Sherlock Holmes to connect the dots. Still, I wasn't ready for the big move yet. People who act too fast look guilty. I needed patience, precision, and a little luck. That luck came 2 days later. I was refilling supplies in exam room 3 when Grace stopped by the clinic for a flu shot. She perched on the exam table like it was a throne. "You know, Dana," she said, her voice dripping with sympathy. "We've all been so concerned. Poor Paul, poor you." "Poor me," I said, smiling. "I'm doing great." Grace blinked, thrown off. "Well, yes, of course, but these things are so upsetting. He's still part of the HOA, technically." "Of course he is," I said. "I wouldn't dream of taking away his right to complain about lawn heights." She leaned closer. "I did see him downtown the other night, with that interior designer. What's her name? Melanie?" I raised an eyebrow. "Grace, I'm shocked. Gossiping about residents? Isn't that against HOA Code 3.2 subsection B?" Her mouth twitched. "I'm just saying, if you ever need proof, I can help." "Oh, I already have proof," I said quietly, enjoying the flicker of surprise that crossed her face. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of wine and a notebook. I started making a list, not of grievances, those I already knew by heart, but of strategies. 1. Keep calm. 2. Maintain image. 3. Control the narrative. 4. Isolate Paul from allies. 5. Let him destroy himself. The plan wasn't revenge for the sake of pain. It was balance. He'd tilted the scale for years, and now I was just bringing it back to level. 2 days later, Paul showed up at the door. No warning, no text. Just the sound of his car in the driveway, and then a knock. When I opened the door, he looked awful. Creased suit, tie loose, eyes ringed with sleeplessness. "Can I come in?" he asked. Depends, I said. Is this a business visit or personal? Dana, please. I stepped aside. He came in, glancing around like the furniture might judge him. They're investigating me, he said. Someone sent those documents to the partners anonymously. I know it was you. Interesting theory, I said, pouring myself coffee. Got any proof? He rubbed his temples. You're enjoying this? I took a slow sip. Not enjoying, just observing. He stared at me for a moment. You've changed. I've adapted, I corrected. He sighed and sat down. I made a mistake, all right? I shouldn't have. I raised a hand. Please don't insult me by calling it a mistake. Ordering the wrong paint color is a mistake. This was a decision. He leaned forward. Dana, you're not innocent in this. You've been cold for years. Stop right there, I said. You're not rewriting the story just because it's convenient. You wanted adventure. You got it. For a moment, we just looked at each other. Then he stood. Fine, you win. Enjoy your little triumph. He left before I could reply. The door clicked shut, and the silence that followed was strangely satisfying. The next few days passed in an odd rhythm. At work, I was the dependable nurse again. At home, I became an observer of small collapses. Paul's firm announced an internal review. Grace's husband started avoiding eye contact, probably tired of his wife's endless reports. Even Melanie vanished from the usual places. Friday evening brought the next act. I was restocking gauze when Tom approached. You free tomorrow? He asked. There's a charity fun run downtown. The clinic's sponsoring a booth. I hesitated. Crowds meant gossip, but also visibility. Sure, I said. Why not? The event was the usual suburban spectacle. Strollers, neon shirts, free coffee. I handed out pamphlets and smiled until my face hurt. Then, around noon, I saw him. Paul, across the street, with Melanie. She was in athletic gear that looked more like an advertisement than clothing, and he was trying too hard to seem relaxed. They looked mismatched now. He, tense and aging under stress. She, young and polished. They didn't see me, but I saw enough. She touched his arm, said something that made him flinch. Then she walked away, leaving him standing there, staring at his phone. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Back at home that afternoon, I replayed the scene in my head. Not out of obsession, but analysis. Melanie was distancing herself. Smart move for her, bad news for him. Without her, his house of cards would crumble faster. That night, I received an unexpected message from one of Paul's co-workers, Sophie, one of the junior architects. You didn't hear it from me, but the partners are furious. Someone tipped off the client about misused funds. Paul's losing his biggest project. I stared at the message, a small smile curling. I hadn't made that call. Someone else had. Maybe karma just worked part-time, but it was good to see it punch in. Saturday morning, I decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. The air was crisp, the kind of day where everything looks cleaner than it is. Grace was trimming her roses, pretending not to wait for me. Morning, I said. Morning, she called too brightly. Heard Paul's firm is having trouble. You don't say, I replied. Maybe they should hire a financial advisor. She nodded, studying me like I was a new species. You're taking this well. I'm just tired of cleaning up after men who can't read instructions. That afternoon, I drove to the city. Not for work, just to breathe air that didn't know me. I wandered through a bookstore, bought a second-hand novel, and sat in a cafe reading. For a few hours, I was no one's wife, no one's roomer, just a woman drinking coffee, planning her next move. When I got home, there was an envelope on my porch. No address, no stamp. Inside, a photo. Paul and Melanie at that restaurant, smiling across the table. Someone had written on the back in neat handwriting, "He's not worth it." No signature, no clue. For a moment, I considered the possibility that it was a warning, maybe even from Melanie herself. But why send it now, unless she wanted to provoke me or warn me that Paul was spiraling? Either way, it didn't matter. The message was true. He wasn't worth it. But the satisfaction of dismantling his empire absolutely was. By Monday, I was back to normal routine. Clinic, groceries, polite nods to neighbors. But under the surface, things were shifting. Paul started calling, leaving messages I didn't return. He sounded less angry now, more desperate. His tone went from, "You'll regret this," to, "We need to talk," in record time. One evening, while cooking, I heard a knock. Not Paul this time. Melanie. She stood on the porch, perfectly composed, as if we were old friends meeting for coffee. "Can we talk?" she asked. "About what?" "Paul," she said simply. "He's losing it. He's blaming me for everything." I folded my arms. "And this concerns me because—" "Because you started it," she said. "He's convinced you're behind his suspension." I smiled. "He's right, but that's not why he's losing everything. He's losing it because he built his life on lies." She looked around nervous. "He's been calling me non-stop, showing up at my place. I think he's looking for someone to blame." "Maybe you should call Grace," I said dryly. "She loves a crisis." Melanie frowned. "Look, I'm not your enemy. I made a mistake." "There's that word again," I interrupted. "You two really should get matching mugs." Her composure cracked for a second. "You're enjoying this?" "No," I said, meeting her gaze. "I'm studying it." She left soon after, slamming her car door hard enough to make the mailbox tremble. I watched her drive off, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and caution. Paul was unraveling, and she knew it. That made her dangerous, too. That night, I opened my laptop and wrote an anonymous email to the firm's HR department, attaching a few more receipts I'd been saving. Nothing illegal, just enough to confirm what they already suspected. Then I shut the laptop and went to bed, sleeping better than I had in weeks. The next morning, Tom caught me smiling at work. "Good day?" "Great day," I said. "It's amazing how clean things get when you stop using cheap materials." He chuckled. "Whatever that means." "It means," I said, "that balance has a beautiful symmetry." That evening, I got another message from Sophie. Paul's partners are considering termination. Word is, they're also contacting clients to assure them the firm's integrity is intact. I poured a glass of wine and toasted the message. Integrity. What a lovely word when it finally worked in your favor. The following week, I started getting polite questions from neighbors. "Are you two separating? Will you sell the house? Are you okay?" I answered each with the same serene smile. "Just a temporary renovation," I'd say. "Every structure needs reinforcement." They'd nod, pretending to understand, and walk away more curious than before. Saturday came again, and I decided it was time to see the destruction up close. I drove to Paul's office. The parking lot was nearly empty. His car was there, though, parked crooked. I waited in the cafe across the street until he came out, holding a box of office items, papers, a model building, a framed photo of us. He stood by his car for a moment, staring at the box, then looked up and saw me. For a second, neither of us moved. Then I raised my cup in a silent toast. He didn't wave back. Driving home, I felt a strange calm. It wasn't triumph, it was release. Like finally finishing a long, exhausting shift and knowing the work was done well. When I turned onto our street, Grace was watering her lawn, pretending not to see me. "Evening, Dana," she called. "Evening, Grace," I said. "Heard Paul's firm is making changes." "They are," I replied. "Sometimes change is good." She smiled, eyes glinting with curiosity. "You're stronger than people think." "I know," I said. "That's why they underestimate me." That night, I sat on the porch with a notebook, writing again. This time, no lists, just thoughts, about how easily people accept facades, how quickly they crumble when someone knocks, about how silence can be louder than shouting. The house behind me glowed warm and tidy. For the first time in months, it felt like mine. Not shared, not borrowed, just mine. Before going in, I looked up at the sky. Clouds moving fast, wind shifting, the kind of night that promises change. I smiled to myself, small and certain. The storm was only beginning to build, and I was learning how to steer it. The week started with the familiar hum of fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic, yet nothing in the clinic could compete with the tension I carried, like a quiet engine under my skin. Paul had been more erratic, checking his phone constantly, pacing the living room, muttering names under his breath. His charm had evaporated, leaving a nervous, scrambling man behind. Observing him was almost entertaining, if it weren't so satisfying to see him finally uncomfortable in the world he thought he controlled. That Monday, I decided it was time to act on the evidence I'd collected. The expense reports, the photographs, the social media posts, all lined up neatly, each file a piece of a puzzle he couldn't see yet. I transferred everything to a small, encrypted flash drive and tucked it into my bag. Walking into work, I felt the familiar sense of precision that comes with planning. A surgeon doesn't improvise during a delicate operation, and neither would I. During a quiet moment, I approached one of the clinic's printers and quietly printed copies of the receipts and emails. The machine hissed, whirred, and delivered stacks of documentation that now held power in their neat, unassuming piles. I labeled each folder with dates, locations, and the types of transactions. My handwriting was calm, neat, deliberate, annotations like a scientist cataloging specimens. Each note made the story undeniable. Paul had been using the firm's resources to fund personal trips, dinners, and evenings with someone who was not me. By the time lunch rolled around, I was perched in my car across from Paul's office, pretending to scroll through a news site while my mind mapped out the next phase. I watched people come and go, interns and assistants with clipboards and casual confidence, none of them suspecting the drama unfolding within. And then, at precisely noon, he emerged. Paul, in his tailored suit, looking like he had rehearsed confidence for a crowd of ghosts. Behind him, she followed, Melanie, radiant in her subtle elegance, wearing a smile that was half triumph, half smug. I didn't flinch. Instead, I observed every gesture, every glance, every unspoken conversation between them. Her hand brushed his arm lightly, and he flinched almost imperceptibly, as though he'd been reminded that he was walking on a tightrope. I noted it all, silently. Documentation had many forms, and witness observation was one of the most powerful. Returning home, I set the flash drive on the counter and poured a glass of wine. The sound of the cork popping was satisfying, ceremonial even. I didn't need to drink it yet. It was a placeholder, a small ritual of control. Then I reviewed the copies I'd printed, dinner receipts paired with project reports, timestamps matching hotel bookings, photos tagged with dates and locations. Every piece told the same story. That evening, Paul came home earlier than usual. He hovered in the entryway, suit jacket slightly wrinkled, eyes darting toward the living room. I was folding laundry, slow, deliberate, letting him stew in the quiet of the house. "Dana," he started, trying for calm, "we need to talk." I looked up, mildly curious. "About what?" "You know," he said, voice low. "Everything. The partners, the emails, the receipts." I smiled. "Everything is right here," I said, tapping the flash drive on the counter. "Do you want to sit down and review?" He froze. I let the pause linger, letting the weight of anticipation build. His hand twitched toward his jacket pocket, perhaps reaching for the phone, perhaps looking for a familiar strategy that no longer worked. He took a step toward me, then stopped. "Dana, please," he said, voice cracking in a way he couldn't fully hide. "I can explain." "Explain?" I echoed slowly, deliberately. "Explain being dishonest. Lying to your wife, using your firm for personal gain, and thinking you could get away with it. He hesitated, swallowing. I could see the struggle, charm and arrogance failing against logic and evidence. I didn't think anyone would notice, he admitted finally. I set the laundry aside and leaned against the counter. Notice, Paul, I noticed, and I documented, and now others will notice too. The silence that followed was heavy, tangible, a living thing in the room. He looked around as though searching for allies in the furniture. Then, slowly, his shoulders slumped, the act of control draining away. For the first time, he seemed small, diminished in a way I had never allowed him to see. The next day, I put part of the plan into motion. I sent an anonymous email to the partners at his firm. No names, no embellishment, just the receipts, dates, hotel bookings, and a few photographs. I included a concise summary highlighting discrepancies between company resources and personal expenses. My hand was steady as I clicked send. Then I sat back, letting the quiet thrill of anticipation wash over me. By mid-morning, the chain reaction began. The partners responded within hours, confirming the review process had been escalated. Paul called me repeatedly, each time more frantic, more pleading, trying to weave excuses that sounded increasingly hollow. I ignored most of them, letting the pressure build. He was unraveling, not because of what I had done, but because the truth, once documented, had a gravity all its own. At work, I maintained composure, a model of efficiency. I walked the halls, checked charts, and smiled at patients, all while my mind calculated the next move. I thought about the way he had carried himself when we met, the pride in his posture, the unearned confidence. Watching that posture collapse became a private satisfaction, a slow burn of justice. Thursday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Melanie. She appeared at the door unannounced, perfectly composed, carrying a portfolio of her work as though she belonged in my living room. "I think we need to talk," she said. "About what?" I asked, folding a sheet. "Paul," she replied simply. "He's losing control, blaming everyone around him, including me." I set the sheet down and studied her. Her expression was carefully neutral, but I could see the tension around her eyes. The energy in the room shifted. She was not here to charm me. She was cautious, aware that the tide had turned. "You should be careful," I said. "I'm very observant." She nodded, finally admitting something I already knew. She had underestimated how far I would go. "He's desperate," she admitted. "I think he's starting to realize that the facade is gone, that you see everything." "I see more than everything," I said, voice calm. "I catalog it, document it, and then act. That's the difference between knowing and using knowledge." She shifted, uncomfortable. "I'm not your enemy," she said, "but I can help you if you want. There's still a chance to—" I cut her off with a raised hand. "You're late to the party, Melanie. And your timing is irrelevant. The system is already in motion. Actions have consequences, and those consequences are about to catch up to Paul." She left soon after, slamming her car door just enough to rattle the mailbox. I watched her drive off, then returned to my notes, feeling the satisfaction of having survived the encounter without giving her any ground. Melanie might be clever, but I was strategic, methodical, and, most importantly, patient. Friday, I put another layer into the plan. I drove to the firm under the guise of delivering supplies for a charity event. I left additional copies of the receipts with the secretary, making sure they were seen by multiple staff members. The more eyes on the evidence, the faster the dominoes would fall. I smiled politely at everyone, small talk about traffic and weather, while internally ticking off boxes on my mental map. Later that day, I returned home and found Paul pacing in the living room. His hands trembled slightly, holding his phone too tightly. "Dana," he began, "you've gone too far. This is getting out of control." I leaned against the counter, coffee mug in hand. "Control, Paul, is relative. You thought you had it. You didn't. I'm merely making adjustments. He swallowed hard. You're going to ruin me. I allowed a slow smile to form. I don't ruin. I expose. And exposure, as you've just learned, has its own power. That night, I reviewed every receipt, every email, every timestamp again. I made additional notes in my notebook, cross-references, potential allies, witnesses. Each detail added another layer of security, another way to make sure the outcome was inevitable. Saturday morning, I decided to test the environment. I drove past the cafe where I'd seen Paul and Melanie, noting any changes. Melanie wasn't there, but her absence spoke volumes. She had retreated, no doubt aware that the current was moving in a direction she couldn't influence. Returning home, I felt a calm certainty. The plan was working. The documentation was clear, the partners were reacting, and Paul's unraveling was visible in every phone call, every frustrated voicemail, every nervous glance. He was losing influence, his carefully constructed image crumbling under its own weight. That evening, I went for a walk through the neighborhood. Grace was watering her flowers, clearly eager for news. I waved casually, keeping my expression neutral, my posture relaxed. The illusion of calm was my armor, my advantage. I let her gossip bubble and spill over, letting the community take the first steps of their own judgment. By nightfall, I was back at the kitchen table, wine glass in hand, reviewing my notes and photographs one last time. The evidence was unassailable. Paul's trajectory was clear, and the chain reaction I had set in motion would continue without interference. I felt a quiet satisfaction, a professional pride, not in the ruin itself, but in the precision of its execution. As I climbed the stairs to bed, the quiet of the house enveloped me. No alarms, no shouting, no confrontation yet, just the weight of inevitability settling over everything. I turned off the bedroom light, leaving the house in shadow, and for the first time, allowed myself to imagine the next phase. Not speculation, not fantasy, but deliberate, controlled steps leading to the culmination of months of observation, documentation, and planning. Tomorrow, the next layer would unfold. I would watch, I would note, and the outcome would edge closer, inevitable and undeniable. And for the first time in years, I slept knowing that power, subtle and methodical, could feel as intoxicating as any rush of emotion. The house settled around me, calm yet charged, like the pause before a storm. And I welcomed it, ready to move forward. Saturday in Maplewood Heights had a strange stillness, the kind that disguises movement until it's unavoidable. I watched from the kitchen window as neighbors went about their weekend routines, trimmed hedges, and chatted over fences. Their eyes skimmed mine occasionally, assessing, guessing, whispering. I let them think I was preoccupied with housework. Underneath that calm surface, the plan continued to evolve. Paul had become predictable in his desperation. Calls, texts, and occasional appearances that now seem more like attempts at surveillance than conversation. He came home late Friday, carrying a box of files he claimed he needed for clarity. I smiled at him, precise and neutral, and placed a glass of water on the counter. "You look tired," I said. "Long day?" He muttered something about meetings and clients, avoiding my gaze. I didn't press. The thrill of watching him unravel quietly was far more satisfying than confrontation at that moment. By mid-morning, I was reviewing the stack of receipts and emails on the dining table, annotating them with notes, dates, and possible connections. Each entry told the same story. Paul had leveraged company resources for personal entertainment, using it as justification for affairs, clandestine dinners, and little lies that stacked up into a foundation of deception. I made a mental note to include a subtle addition, some evidence of minor manipulations at work, nothing illegal, but enough to highlight the pattern. The goal was not to punish him violently, but to dismantle the carefully constructed image he thought untouchable. Later, I took a walk through the neighborhood. Grace was out front, pruning roses as if she had the authority of a queen in her domain. I waved and smiled casually, and she responded with a subtle tilt of her head, trying to gauge my mood. I let her curiosity simmer. Gossip was a tool, and Grace had been wielding it for decades. By letting her believe she had insight, I allowed her to move my pieces without realizing she was being guided. After lunch, I decided it was time for direct action. I drove past Melanie's apartment, not to confront, but to observe. The red car I had seen weeks ago was gone, the door locked, the windows shuttered. No one was coming or going. I imagined her walking through the apartment, reviewing her wardrobe, calculating her next move. Clever as she was, the universe had begun to tighten around Paul, and by extension, anyone involved with him. That evening, Paul returned home earlier than usual, looking strained, the corners of his mouth pressed in a thin line. He carried nothing this time, just the weight of anticipation. "Dana," he said, voice low, attempting authority that had long since begun to slip. "We need to resolve this. People are talking." I sipped my wine slowly. "Resolution is subjective, Paul. What exactly do you want?" "To talk," he replied, "face to face. We can sort this out before it gets worse." I placed my glass on the counter and tilted my head slightly. "You mean before everyone sees what has already been documented? Before the emails and receipts paint a picture you can no longer control?" He shifted, frowning, unsure how to respond. I saw the change in his stance, the slight hesitation that comes from realizing you no longer hold the narrative. "Dana, please," he said again, but the force behind it was fading. The next day, I executed a more deliberate move. I visited the firm under the pretense of delivering medical supplies for a charity event that they were sponsoring. Everyone smiled and nodded, unaware of the small packet of evidence I left with the front desk, copies of receipts, notes, and a concise report detailing the discrepancies between company resources and personal trips. I maintained my composure, chatted about traffic and weather, and left before anyone could suspect the reason for my visit. Friday arrived, and Paul's panic became visible. I sat in the living room, folding laundry, when his car pulled into the driveway. He entered the house with a box of office items, papers spilling over the sides. His eyes searched mine, hoping for mercy, but he found only calm observation. "Dana," he began, voice tight, "this is spiraling. You've gone too far." "I'm simply letting events follow their natural course," I said. "You set the pieces in motion. I am merely cataloguing the outcome." He sighed and muttered something under his breath, pacing. "You're going to ruin me." "Ruin?" I said. "No, Paul. The word you're looking for is exposure. Your choice has exposed you, and now the results are visible to those who matter." He slumped into the nearest chair, muttering apologies that carried no real weight. I let him sit in the quiet discomfort, noting every small tremor in his voice, every defensive gesture, the twitch in his fingers. Observation was as precise as any other tool I had at my disposal. Later, I made my next move. I sent a carefully worded, anonymous email to the firm's partners, summarizing the patterns of misuse and attaching supporting evidence. No embellishments, no personal vendettas, only facts. I smiled at the clarity of my actions. The dominoes were aligned, and the chain reaction had begun. Saturday morning, I walked through the neighborhood again, letting the air clear my thoughts. Grace was out front again, nodding as if she had insider knowledge. I waved, keeping my expression neutral. Each interaction, every glance, was part of a larger social dance that I had learned to manipulate. Gossip had power, and I knew how to let it work in my favor without overplaying my hand. By afternoon, I was ready to test the effect of my actions. I drove past the cafe where Paul and Melanie had been spotted weeks earlier. Melanie was absent, no sign of her or the red car. Paul, however, was visible across the street, pacing in front of his office. I noted his posture, the tension in his shoulders, the way he checked his phone repeatedly. He looked isolated, vulnerable, and increasingly aware of the consequences of his decisions. Returning home, I found Paul attempting to compose himself in the living room. His eyes flicked toward the flash drive on the counter. "Dana," he said, voice measured but strained, "you've gone too far." I leaned against the counter, coffee in hand. "I'm not going far, Paul. I'm observing, and the results are inevitable." He hesitated, searching for an argument that would hold. "You're enjoying this?" "I'm not enjoying. I'm cataloguing," I corrected. "There's a difference." His frustration was palpable, but he had little recourse. Every action I had taken was measured, calculated, and documented. He could argue, plead, or protest, but the evidence and the subtle network of influence surrounding him had begun to close in. That evening, I returned to my notes, reviewing the documentation once more. Each receipt, email, and photograph reinforced the trajectory I had set in motion. I outlined potential next steps, carefully considering the social and professional reactions that would follow. Patience was a tool I wielded as deliberately as any physical action. Saturday night brought an unexpected message from one of Paul's co-workers. "The partners are reviewing his files. Word is, they are preparing for a meeting about his conduct." I smiled at the timing. I hadn't initiated this message, but the momentum I had generated was creating its own feedback loop. Paul's fall was accelerating, not due to my direct action alone, but because the evidence had gained visibility beyond his control. Sunday, I spent the morning cleaning, organizing, and reviewing. Each move was deliberate, each interaction measured. Grace passed by, nodding, her eyes full of speculation. I allowed her to believe she had insight. In truth, she had no idea of the meticulous planning behind my actions. In the afternoon, I noticed Paul standing at the window across the street, peering toward his car as if measuring some unknown variable. I watched him, noting every micro-expression, anxiety, frustration, the faint trace of regret. He was aware, now, that his control had slipped entirely. That evening, I prepared dinner, folding in small domestic gestures that belied the intensity of my calculations. Paul entered the house, hesitant, pacing the room as he searched for an argument or an opportunity to regain footing. I greeted him calmly, serving the meal with precision. He stared at the table, muttering about mistakes and misunderstandings. I listened, recording each phrase mentally, cataloguing each subtle inflection. Later, after he left for a supposed meeting with his mother, I reviewed the documents once more. My strategy had several layers: exposure through documentation, social reinforcement via neighborhood gossip, and psychological observation of his increasingly desperate behavior. Each element reinforced the others, creating a system where failure on his part was inevitable. Monday morning, I woke with a sense of calm focus. I reviewed the next steps, considering interactions with colleagues, neighbors, and the occasional visit to places Paul frequented. Observation, documentation, and subtle pressure continued to form the framework of his unraveling. I was patient, strategic, and precise, qualities I had honed through years of work, life, and quiet endurance. By evening, the first tangible results appeared. A message from the firm's HR confirmed that Paul's suspension was extended pending further review. Another call from Sophie, a junior colleague, noted that the partners were concerned about client confidence. The ripple effects were spreading exactly as planned. I allowed myself a small smile. There was no triumph yet, only progress. Each calculated step had brought me closer to the inevitable confrontation, a point where control would no longer be in his hands. That night, as the house settled into quiet, I sat on the porch with my notebook and pen. The air was crisp, the kind that sharpens focus. I wrote observations, annotated strategies, and reflected on the subtle power of patience and precision. Tomorrow, I knew, would bring more movement, Paul would react, neighbors would speculate, and the forces I had set in motion would gain momentum. I felt prepared, aware, and entirely in control. The neighborhood slept under the illusion of calm, unaware that the foundations of one life were quietly, deliberately unraveling. And I welcomed the quiet night, knowing that each careful action brought the inevitable confrontation ever closer. Monday arrived with a quiet sense of inevitability. The streets of Maplewood Heights were bright and manicured, as if the world outside my house hadn't shifted at all, but inside, the momentum I had built was accelerating. Paul's life, which had always seemed so controlled, was beginning to wobble under its own weight. His attempts at authority were weaker, more scattered. His voice, once confident, now carried the faint edge of pleading. I found it fascinating to observe, noting every hesitation, every defensive gesture, every carefully measured smile that no longer worked on anyone. I spent the morning at the clinic, meticulously reviewing patient charts and lab results, but my mind wasn't fully on the work at hand. It was elsewhere, mapping Paul's next moves, predicting his reactions, and noting vulnerabilities. By noon, I had a plan for another layer of pressure, subtle, unavoidable, and entirely legal. I called a few trusted contacts in the city, framing questions and inquiries in a casual, almost incidental way. Nothing traceable, just enough nudges to ensure the dominoes kept falling. That afternoon, I drove to the firm under the guise of delivering a report for a charity event, my standard method for leaving discreet information in plain sight. The receptionist barely looked up as I handed over an envelope with the neatly annotated copies of receipts and hotel records. Each piece reinforced the narrative that Paul could no longer argue against. I smiled politely, engaged in small talk about traffic and weather, and left before anyone could suspect the significance of my visit. The quiet thrill of control coursed through me. There was a unique satisfaction in knowing the chain of events was now moving without my constant intervention. Back at home, I arranged the documents I had collected on the dining table, reviewing timelines, timestamps, and email correspondences. Each piece told the same story. Paul had exploited company resources, built secret dinners and trips under false pretenses, and relied on charm to avoid scrutiny. I made notes of possible interactions, neighbors who might unknowingly contribute to his unraveling, and colleagues who had begun to question his reliability. The next layer of my plan involved observation, patient yet precise, ensuring that each domino would topple in order. That evening, Paul arrived home earlier than expected. His posture was tense, shoulders stiff, eyes darting around the living room as though searching for invisible witnesses. He carried nothing but his frustration, the weight of impending exposure etched across his face. "Dana," he began, voice tight, "we need to discuss this." I leaned against the counter, a glass of wine in hand, calm, deliberate. "Discuss what, Paul? Your choices, or the consequences of them?" "Both," he muttered, but the certainty behind his words had dissolved. I smiled faintly. "You've already set the stage. I'm merely observing the performance." His jaw tightened, and he sat in the nearest chair, running a hand over his face. "You don't understand. You're going to ruin me." I placed my glass down, maintaining eye contact. "Ruin? No, exposure, Paul. Transparency. You created the conditions. I'm just cataloguing the outcome." That night, after he had retreated to his room, I reviewed every detail again, considering possible interactions for the coming days. There was an elegance in the methodical approach to dismantling a life built on deception. Each carefully documented transaction, each overlooked dinner, each casual lie, became a piece of evidence too precise to dispute. I organized notes, cross-referenced receipts with social media posts, and considered subtle ways to increase pressure without overt confrontation. By Wednesday, the effects of my previous actions began to manifest more visibly. Paul's calls became erratic, sometimes pleading, sometimes defensive. His attempts to manipulate colleagues or friends to regain credibility had started to backfire. Observing him from the living room window, I noted the familiar red car of Melanie parked outside. She had returned, likely attempting to intervene, but her timing was off. Paul was already unraveling on his own. The irony was not lost on me. That evening, I prepared a quiet dinner. Paul entered the house carrying files he claimed were for review. His eyes lingered on the flash drive I had left in plain sight. "Dana," he began, voice strained, "you're overstepping." I poured a glass of water, maintaining a calm demeanor. "I'm simply observing, Paul. Each action you take contributes to a chain reaction. The outcome is inevitable." He slumped into a chair, muttering apologies that lacked conviction. I made no response, letting the silence speak louder than any argument. Thursday brought a critical development. I received an anonymous tip from a junior colleague at his firm, Sophie, confirming that the partners were reviewing Paul's files with increasing scrutiny. The evidence I had planted, combined with the natural progression of events, was now creating institutional pressure. Paul's panic intensified with each phone call, each email, each conversation he could not control. The web was tightening, and I could see it reflected in his behavior: hesitation, defensiveness, and an almost visible erosion of confidence. By Friday, Paul was visibly worn. I observed him pacing the living room while attempting to compose emails to his colleagues, each draft more frantic than the last. The strategic timing of my interventions had left him with limited options. He had begun to misstep, revealing minor contradictions and inconsistencies that further reinforced the narrative of mismanagement. Each small slip was catalogued mentally, preparing me for the next calculated move. That evening, I decided to escalate the psychological pressure subtly. I visited Melanie's apartment, not to confront, but to make her aware of my presence. I let my shadow fall across the doorway and she looked up, startled. "Dana," she said cautiously. "You've been busy," I replied evenly. "Observing, adjusting, calculating. Your timing is off." She swallowed, understanding immediately that my presence was a signal, a reminder that I was in control of the narrative. "I didn't—" "You underestimated the consequences," I said. "Paul built a life on shortcuts and illusions. Each action now has repercussions, and I'm ensuring that they are visible and inevitable." I left after a few minutes, leaving her to absorb the warning without any direct confrontation. The thrill was in the subtlety, the quiet assertion of control without overt action. Saturday morning, I prepared for the next layer: observation of Paul's attempts to salvage his professional image. I parked discreetly near his office, watching him through the tinted windshield. He emerged carrying a box of personal items, looking both tense and disoriented. The weight of the evidence and the cascading consequences were visibly affecting him. Returning home, I placed a folder on the kitchen table, organizing the documents for a final review. The pieces of the puzzle aligned neatly, each file, receipt, and photograph reinforcing the inevitable exposure. I reviewed every detail, noting potential interactions with colleagues, clients, and neighbors that could amplify the consequences. That evening, Paul attempted a confrontation. He entered the living room, his hands slightly trembling, eyes searching for some leverage. "Dana," he began, "you've gone too far." I tilted my head, observing him like a patient assessing a case. "Too far? I'm merely documenting the natural outcome of your choices." He swallowed hard, frustrated. "You're enjoying this." "I'm not enjoying," I said. "I'm ensuring accuracy. Observation has its own reward." His tension was palpable, but he had little leverage left. I maintained calm, reinforcing the subtle dominance of the situation without any need for aggression. Each interaction, each carefully considered word, reinforced the momentum I had built. By Sunday, the final threads of influence were in motion. The firm's partners had begun to contact clients directly, confirming discrepancies and ensuring transparency. Paul's attempts to regain control were visible but ineffective. I reviewed the documentation one last time, making minor annotations to ensure clarity and precision. As evening settled over Maplewood Heights, I sat on the porch with my notebook and pen, cataloguing observations and preparing for the culmination of the strategy. The neighborhood appeared peaceful, unaware that the careful orchestration of events had placed Paul's life on a trajectory he could no longer control. I felt a calm satisfaction, not from triumph, but from precision. Each layer of planning, observation, and subtle intervention had built an unassailable chain of events. The confrontation was near, the consequences were clear, and the system I had engineered was operating as intended. The air cooled, rustling leaves along the street, yet inside the house, everything was deliberate, measured, and controlled. I prepared for the next day, knowing that the momentum of the week had brought me closer to the ultimate outcome. Paul's unraveling was nearly complete, and I would be ready to observe, to guide, and finally, to conclude the process I had meticulously set in motion. By the time the porch light flickered off, I felt a sense of readiness. Every detail, every observation, every carefully documented file pointed to the inevitable confrontation. The system was functioning flawlessly. The final act of exposure and revelation was imminent, and I would be fully prepared to witness the result of months of careful calculation, strategic patience, and unrelenting observation. The quiet of the night wrapped around the house, concealing the tension that had built in every interaction, every document, and every subtle move. Tomorrow, the plan would advance further, the consequences would become undeniable, and Paul would finally confront the full weight of his choices. I welcomed the night, knowing that control, precision, and patience had brought me to the brink of the final stage. The morning was crisp and sharp, sunlight slicing through the blinds in neat diagonal lines. Maplewood Heights looked unchanged from the street, a postcard-perfect suburban neighborhood where nothing ever seemed to shake. But inside my house, and in the lives I had quietly manipulated over the past weeks, everything was poised for a reckoning. Paul was on the brink, Melanie had retreated to her own corner, and the dominoes I had set were trembling, waiting for the final push. I spent the early hours reviewing the evidence again, not out of doubt but out of precision. Receipts, emails, photographs, notes meticulously cross-referenced. Each piece was placed like a keystone in an arch. Remove one, and the structure would wobble. Leave them all, and the collapse would be undeniable. I wasn't angry, not in the conventional sense. I was deliberate, focused, and patient. By mid-morning, I drove to the location I had selected for the final confrontation. It was a half-finished construction site for one of Paul's projects, the scaffolding half erected, floors exposed, and walls skeletal. Symbolic, practical, and contained, the perfect stage. The site was quiet, the only sounds the occasional flutter of a tarp in the wind and distant traffic from the street. Paul arrived shortly after me, his car crunching over gravel. He stepped out, hands in pockets, shoulders hunched slightly, eyes flicking around as though searching for witnesses and excuses. He carried nothing. There was no armor left in his hands or his demeanor. He approached cautiously. "Dana," he said, voice tight, attempting authority but failing. "We need to—" I held up a hand, stopping him before the words could escape. "Save it, Paul. Every word you could say has already been documented. Every action you've taken is already recorded. This isn't about discussion, it's about acknowledgement." His face tightened, but he hesitated, scanning the site as if the partially built walls might offer some form of protection. They did not. I stepped closer, slow, deliberate, maintaining a neutral expression, letting him feel the quiet inevitability I carried. You've built walls, Paul, I said, voice calm. But walls are only as strong as the foundation, and your foundation is cracked. He opened his mouth, perhaps to argue, perhaps to charm. I ignored it. I had rehearsed my own motions for this moment, the exact sequence of control and observation, ensuring that nothing would destabilize the outcome. I reached into my bag and retrieved the folder containing the final copies of receipts, emails, and photographs. I laid them across a nearby beam, letting the papers flutter slightly in the breeze. Paul's eyes followed each sheet, a mixture of recognition and unease crossing his features. This, I said, gesturing to the folder, is every trip, every dinner, every falsified expense, every moment you thought no one was watching, every hand you held, every lie you told. It's all here. He swallowed, hands tightening into fists. You don't understand. I understand perfectly, I interrupted. I understand that you thought charm and selective memory would shield you. I understand that you underestimated the people around you, and I understand that the consequences of your choices are not negotiable. A gust of wind swept through the site, scattering a few of the papers. I picked one up and held it between my fingers, letting him see the clear, undeniable record. He stepped back, glancing around, calculating, attempting to find some avenue of escape. There was none. The site was empty except for the two of us, and every element of it highlighted the collapse of his control: exposed beams, unfinished walls, scaffolding with gaps he could not traverse. You built facades, Paul, I continued, thinking that appearances mattered more than truth. But appearances are fragile. Truth is persistent. He shook his head, muttering under his breath. I noted every micro-expression, the twitch of his eye, the tightening of his jaw, the subtle trembling of his hands. Observation had become as much a weapon as the documentation I held. Then he did something I hadn't expected. He laughed, sharp and brittle. You think this proves anything? It proves more than you can handle, I replied, voice level. It proves that lies, no matter how carefully constructed, eventually face the consequences they deserve. It proves that I am not someone to be underestimated. He took a step forward, hesitant but defiant. I held my ground, silent, letting the weight of inevitability press down without a word. The wind shifted again, rustling the papers across the site, scattering some to the exposed beams and floors. The site seemed to echo the unraveling of his composure, each sound magnified in the quiet space. I still have connections, he said, voice rising slightly. People will believe me. I can explain. No one needs explanations, I said firmly. You've explained enough through your own actions. Now it's time for acknowledgement. He hesitated, glancing at the scattered papers, then back at me. The realization began to dawn. He had no leverage left, no charm, no authority, no allies standing between him and the consequences of his decisions. His facade had crumbled completely, and the exposure I had orchestrated was final and comprehensive. I stepped closer, close enough for him to feel my presence as deliberate and unyielding. Sign here, I said, producing a folder with the documents necessary to transfer ownership of the house, to finalize records, and to ensure that every financial and professional misstep was accounted for. Admit that every choice you made, every attempt to manipulate, and every dishonest act is yours. There is no defense left. He hesitated, the air thick with tension. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the pen, then paused, looking at me for what seemed like a question that didn't exist. I did not flinch. My expression remained calm, neutral, and deliberate. Finally, he signed. The sound of the pen scratching across paper was quieter than I expected, but it carried a weight that filled the site more completely than any words could. I collected the signed documents and held them up for him to see. There was no victory in gloating, only the satisfaction of precision and inevitability. As he slumped back slightly, releasing the tension in his shoulders that had been coiled for weeks, I gestured toward the site. Everything is visible now, Paul. No walls, no facades, no illusions, just the reality of your actions. He said nothing, merely staring at the papers, the site, the wind that tossed the remaining documents across the exposed floorboards. I noted each expression, each subtle flicker of understanding and regret, cataloguing them in the quiet observation that had guided every step of this process. I turned to leave, but paused at the threshold, glancing back. One final observation, I said. Integrity, Paul, is not built on charm or perception, it's built on truth. And now, that truth is undeniable. He looked up at me, eyes wide, shoulders sagging. He had reached the end of the narrative he thought he controlled. There were no explanations left, no defenses, and no way to repair the carefully documented collapse of his constructed world. As I walked away from the site, the papers fluttered in the wind, scattering across scaffolding and unfinished floors. The sound was quiet, almost ceremonial, each sheet a testament to actions, decisions, and consequences. I felt no satisfaction in revenge itself, only in the precision, the inevitability, and the clarity of the outcome. The neighborhood beyond the construction site remained as it always did, quiet, manicured, deceptively peaceful. Inside the house, and across the streets, the consequences of hidden choices were now visible, undeniable, and complete. I stopped at the edge of the property, looking back once more at Paul, standing among the scattered papers, shoulders slumped, face pale under the sunlight. I did not feel triumph, only a profound calm. The meticulous orchestration, the layers of observation, the careful manipulation of events, all had led to this precise moment. As I walked to my car, I allowed myself a small, controlled smile. The system I had designed had functioned flawlessly, and the final confrontation had achieved the outcome I had orchestrated from the beginning. Paul's unraveling was complete, documented, and inescapable. Sliding into the driver's seat, I exhaled slowly, appreciating the stillness of the air, the quiet of the site, and the precision of the moment. The neighborhood remained unaware, the streets bright and perfect, while behind one skeletal construction site, accountability had been delivered, unequivocal and absolute. Driving away, I felt the full weight of the strategy completed, the final observation noted, and the carefully guided outcome secured. There were no further actions necessary, no epilogue, no ceremonies beyond the quiet knowledge that precision, patience, and meticulous calculation had brought this chapter to its natural, inevitable, and fully justified conclusion. The house, the site, the documents, and Paul's recognition of his own actions, all were resolved. The culmination of months of careful observation, patient planning, and deliberate intervention had reached its final peak. As I merged onto the main street, the calm of the afternoon enveloped me. The sequence was complete, the consequences fully realized, and the system I had built had functioned exactly as intended. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe fully, the cool air filling my lungs. There was no lingering tension, no threat remaining, only the quiet, absolute clarity that comes from the completion of a carefully executed plan. Every step, every observation, every carefully placed document had led to this moment. Paul's facade had collapsed, the truth had been exposed, and the consequences had been delivered with precision and certainty. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets of Maplewood Heights, I felt an unspoken finality. The confrontation, the documentation, and the inevitable acknowledgement of actions were complete. I drove on, aware that every move, every observation, and every layer of strategy had been executed perfectly, bringing the story to its precise, logical, and climactic conclusion.